MTP Fusion with two crossing 4.0mm cannulated compression screws. Introduction. We're going to be performing a first metatarsophalangeal joint fusion with two 4mm crossed CCS screws. The indication for this procedure is a painful hallux rigidus with a painful grind test throughout the arc of motion of the joint. As can be seen in this case, there is evidence of dorsal osteophytes, which can be consistent with a diagnosis of hallux rigidus. Anatomical landmarks and approach. We demarcate the anatomy for a medial midline approach by identifying the proximal phalanx, the metatarsophalangeal joint, and the metatarsal shaft. We make an interconnecting line joining these dots, followed by a skin incision. We deepen our dissection, being careful of the dorsomedial branch of the superficial peroneal nerve supplying the great toe, as injury to this structure can cause a painful neuroma. Here you can see the dorsomedial sensory branch to the great toe, which we will preserve and protect. We then incise the first metatarsophalangeal joint capsule to expose the joint, and the collateral ligament must be excised on both sides. The first metatarsal head has now been presented to the field of view, and we start our joint preparation with a bone nibbler to the surface. Joint preparation with bone nibblers. It is important to prepare the joint surfaces all the way down to healthy, bleeding cancellous bone to ensure good fusion on both sides, but also be mindful not to shorten the first ray. All cartilage must be denuded to prevent non-union and achieve solid fusion from this procedure. It is important to obtain a spherical shape of the bone to mobilize, rotate, and achieve the desired position of fusion. Maintain the medial eminence of the metatarsal head and do not take this portion away, as this will provide a stable buttress to allow seating of the head of one of the 4mm screws. If this is excised, it may cause a loss of stability for any purchase of the 4mm CCS screw head, meaning that the tri-lock plating system may be required to supplement fixation. Next, we prepare the base of the proximal phalanx using bone nibblers, or a 4mm burr on power with saline irrigation throughout. We are now down to healthy, bleeding cancellous bone in the proximal phalanx and metatarsal head, which should provide a good surface for union to occur. There is still a small bit of cartilage left on the metatarsal head, which we need to remove. It is important for the fusion site to have channels, which are essentially pockets of spaces that allow for the bone morphogenic proteins to cross into the fusion site. These channels are created with a 1.6mm K-wire or 1.5mm drill centering from the peripheries of each surface and aiming towards the center point. From our fusion, we are aiming for 10 degrees of dorsiflexion, 5 degrees of valgus or neutral rotation of the toe, which can be guided by the toenail. K-wire placement. We pass two crossed 1.25mm K-wires, ensuring adequate purchase in the bone on either side. Our first wire is positioned in a distal to proximal direction, starting on the proximal phalanx and passing retrograde into the metatarsal shaft, starting plantar and aiming more dorsally. Our second wire is positioned in a proximal to distal direction, starting dorsally and aiming more plantar. We now have the fusion sides held and stabilized with two cross K-wires. A critical component of this operation is to simulate weight bearing using a flat surface. We use the surface from the tray of the 4mm CCS screw system to place under the sole of the foot to assess whether the toe is adequately positioned and whether the toe needs to be able to lift off the tray. Here, the toe is in around 10 degrees dorsiflexion, which equates to around 5mm elevation of the tray surface. Screw fixation. We measure the screw size for the 4mm screws by using the corresponding measuring guide for the 1.25mm by 200mm K-wires. We subtract 5mm from the measurement to allow for compression at the fusion sites, and we will do the same for the distal to proximal screws as well. We use the drill guide to place over the proximal to distal screw, and then use the APTUS 4mm drill to cross into the proximal phalanx. We now use the countersink over the wire and finally place the screw across the fusion site. We now position the distal to proximal screw by performing the same series of maneuvers. Closure. Closure is with Vicryl to the capsule, supplemented by a 2.0 Vicryl to the fat, followed by a 3.0 monocryl subcuticular stitch. Final X-ray. Post-operative protocol.